Welcome to day 2 of Typographics, the design festival for people who use type. I'm Ellen Lupton. I'm a proud graduate of Cooper Union. The great people at Cooper Union have produced this festival for 7 years now. This year, Typographics is a truly global event with 10 guest curators from different parts of the world. Today's event is curated by Shiva Nallerperumal, who has invited 3 designers and creative teams to speak today. Before I introduce Shiva, please enjoy these animations created for the conference by our sponsors. The curator of today's session is Shiva Nallerperumal, a graphic designer, type designer, and art director. He is co-founder of the design practice November with Juhi Vishnani. November works with clients from the realms of art, film, and culture. As a type designer, Shiva has produced work with Typotech, Bold Monday, Sharp Type, and Lost Type Co-op. In 2017, he became the first graphic designer named in the Forbes India 30 Under 30 list. In 2019, his studio November was inducted into the esteemed Alliance Graphique Internationale. Shiva earned an MFA in graphic design from MICA in Baltimore, USA, where I'm on the graduate faculty and where he will serve as designer in residence this year. And we're just so excited to have you back, Shiva. Welcome, welcome to Typographics.
Thank you so much.
It's so great to see you. Where are you today?
I am speaking from Goa. It's in the west. It's a coastal city in India. It's the last place that the hippies came to. So
the Beatles. I'm sorry you missed that, Shiva. Well, take it away. We're just so thrilled to have you here. Have a great event.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Typographics for giving me this opportunity, especially to curate for the India section of the festival. It was a very, very difficult job because right now, in the past 5 years, I think there's been an advent of graphic design, proliferation of graphic design in India. Incredible talents from all over the place have been popping up. So in this context of typographic work, I chose 3 speakers who all represent various varied and very different kinds of different sides of the spectrum when we talk about typographic work. I'll introduce the first speakers. First, we have Charu Pragya and Aarman Roy of Akademi Mag. Charu is the founder editor of Akademi Mag, a research and communications associate at Tandem Research. She recently graduated from Columbia University in New York with a master's degree in philosophy. She's passionate about economic justice, worker well-being, and strives to illuminate those issues through her work. Aarman Roy is an Indian designer and visual artist with an interest in typography and 3D design, studying in School of Visual Arts in New York. He's the co-founder of Akademi. He has previously worked with Wired and Walsh and ArtCamp, and is currently a design intern at Apple. Congratulations. His work has been featured on Intern magazine and he has spoken previously at Type Weekend. Akademi Mag itself, what they're going to be talking about, is an independent India-based collective of writers, designers, artists, and thinkers who have come together at a time when freedom of press and of the arts has never been more of an urgent concern. Akademi aspires to be a place for imaginative, critical, and unconventional stories, art, and thought experiments, with a mission to always put their contributors first. Akademi Mag, personally, it came out in a very tumultuous time in our nation's history, which was the end of 2019, which also witnessed the largest protest in the history of humanity in our country. And Akademi Mag was one of the magazines that kind of covered that in a very, very visual and interesting way. It's funny because freedom of press has never been more under threat in our country. And these guys chose to start a new magazine at this point. And they have visual design, typography, and the tools of graphic design at the forefront of this. So very, very excited to introduce them. And guys, take it away.
Thank you so much, Shiva, and thank you, Typographics, for having us here. It really is an honor. A few years back, when Aarman and I were both students in New York, actually gifted him tickets to Typographics. It costed me a pretty penny, but it was worth it. So we've really come full circle, and we're so happy to be here. Great, so we'll get started. Aarman, do you want to share the slides? Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, it's just been a bit difficult to organize this while we're in different continents, so please forgive us for any missteps. So like Shiva said, Akademi Mag is an independent India-based publication, and we aspire to be a place for imaginative and critical and conventional stories, with a mission to always put our contributors first. We primarily want to be a safe space for things that might not be able to easily find a home elsewhere. And we recognize and want to address this as an acute need of our present political and social moment in India. So I'd like to start this presentation by just locating Aarman and me for the audience in place and in spirit. So I'm based out of Goa, India, just like Shiva. It's a coastal state, and Aarman's currently in New York. He attends school there. He's finishing up this year. Next slide. Great. This is just a very rough Venn diagram of how we identify ourselves as professionals and people. So I'm the editor at large for Akademi Mag, but we often have other editors who either come on as like a contributing editor or on a voluntary basis. I'm also a labor researcher with a think tank based in Goa. I'm a writer, reluctant academic, and because Aarman's the art director, but like I have the final words from the art director's art director. Aarman is an illustrator and a 3D and motion designer. He's currently an intern at Apple. I think it's quite important for us to just lay it out, because I mean our critique is obviously like bracketed by our material conditions, and we might come off as hypocrites. So just want to put it out first. So Aarman's an intern at Apple currently. I work at a think tank, and I'm currently working on projects with the World Bank and the German Development Authority. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, great. So with Akademi, our wager is that with more visible publications of this sort, and there are many, especially digital publications in India, that are openly committed to progressive counter projects and movements, we actually might conceive of diluting the thrall of uncritical politics in India, the moment that we're currently living through. So we're trying to build a space and place for reflection and critical engagement. Visual design has always been a central element of the magazine's identity since its very conception, but its role and influence became more pronounced when we started experimenting with the carousel format on Instagram for a while, and then a truly formative moment struck. We realized that being a long form publication, or at least aspirationally long form, on a visual platform is not to our detriment, but an opportunity to grab unearned authority and cultural significance. And actually, I might be completely off the mark here, but we did start believing that by employing highly designed visual gateways, it just sort of gave us an air of credibility that we weren't deserving of at the time. Of course, like the written word is primary, but the responsibility of creating these visual gateways between the reader and the piece is also an immense responsibility, because like what happens if the design doesn't do the writing and the efforts of the writers and the editors justice? So we started publishing as a digital magazine in August 1st, 2020. For a while before that, we were just functioning as a blog. The fact that we're giving a talk about Akademi still feels a bit absurd to me, because for almost a year and a half now, it's largely just been Aarman and me, like two clueless 20-somethings, working under the aegis of the Akademi Mag banner. And I doubt people outside our immediate social circle even knew this was the case. But of course, like we've had some incredible writers and brilliant editorial volunteers over the years. We couldn't really have reached here without them. So we understand our existence in society, in communities, whether they be digital or in cyberspace or in real life, through the prism of images produced and diffused in our environments, images that saturate our physical and mental environments. And design often plays an agential yet superficial role in our own formulation. The aesthetic, as you can see here, is literally surface level. If one want to imagine Instagram carousels to have layers, it would just be the topmost layer waiting for you to scratch underneath it. So moving forward, just to give you a little context and theory, it isn't just sharp graphics. There is an implicit theory, a clear philosophical position, maybe even a worldview behind all this effort. I can identify a laundry list of concerns and motivations that led us to taking this huge, truly huge leap of faith, like Shiva said, earlier, we started the project in 2019, which, well, yeah, like it just wasn't like the best time to start an independent, small, radical publication in India, but we're still surviving somehow. One of the primary concerns that undergird our project is Deweyan in nature. John Dewey, for those who are tuning in from India, was Ambedkar's professor of political philosophy at Columbia. And he was an extremely important figure in the field of everyday aesthetics and American political thought. So one of Dewey's solutions to the core problems of a democratic public was more active and open circulation of information. But improbably, though, his second central solution was aesthetic in nature. Dewey argued that it was only the artist who could make the products of technical social inquiry broadly palatable to the public. This made artistic practice a potent form of communication through which communities could develop and act on political agendas. So I first chanced upon his school of thought and his works in the spring of 2019. Back then, I was enrolled in a class on American pragmatism with Philip Kitcher at Columbia University, and we were reading The Public and Its Problems by Dewey. So the seminar didn't really have any emphasis on art or artistic practice, but I did soon enough become more or less obsessed with Dewey's arguments about art in relation to public life in a democracy. What he argued for was to make artistic practice a potent form of communication, which it just struck a chord with me. And sure, like this amount of visual latency can be very tricky to achieve, especially in a world which just favors lexical declarations, like favors facts, favors figures, not really like the subtlety and delicacy of art. So Dewey argued regardless that it was particularly artworks that embodied political possibilities that are not elsewhere actualized. Thus, art in these contexts, especially political and social contexts, is a really important arena for the use of our imagination. In other words, according to Dewey, attention must be paid to the aesthetic quality of the presentation of events and news in the broader information economy. So if just because you're a media organization or a news portal doesn't really mean that you have to write off art. Actually, that's all the more reason for you to make it central to your publishing practice. And it's only through these transactions, like these designed art experiences, that the broader public, general public, can really ever receive these ideas. It might be like through literary writing, it might be through visual art, which is, both of them are the case like for Akademi. So what we, like in line with this, what we are trying to cultivate is like subtle and delicate, like vivid, responsive art, right? That's in response to discursive communication. But at the end of the day, I mean, who are we really kidding? Like both of us combined spend at least 20 hours on Instagram every day, partially for work and partially for, well, just doom scrolling. And one must ask themselves how much subversion or resistance can possibly be designed, especially when designed such a commercial, was thought of such a commercial activity. And when it's mediated through what we understand or commonly as a democratization of art and discourse on social media. And this democratization is good in and of itself, but it comes at a really big cost in the digital age. This democratization, this freedom to create and consume may be an illusion. Maybe it's not freedom at all. At the end of the day, we are all enslaved by the algorithm. You can't really escape it. Like it dictates everything that you view, everything that you click on. Or better yet, like I said, it's completely fiction. But periodically it is useful. And in other times it's an imperative. for discourse in the age of social media, because more people could report on the news or get to voice their opinions than they ever have before in the history of humanity. Sure, like our digital feeds are flooded with text, opinions, facts, and they're all very immaculately designed to be fitted within and mediated through an already designed platform, screaming for attention through their use of typefaces and colors. Even within the context of social media and big tech, design is not negative in the making of its use values. It becomes only so when certain other values, the commercial values, intervene into and become coded in these platforms and a larger supply chain. So yeah, so we also wanted to politically situate our project, and the ways in which we've transgressed, the ways in which we attempt to disrupt like the context, like in our own way. And it's really important to sort of preface that with the admission that there is no things as neutral media. So we do very openly adopt like the ideology of progressive politics. Like we don't shy away from saying that sure, like our lenses are tainted, that tainted pink, and we bring our own biases and our own values to the things that we write and design, and we're quite open to criticism. So over the past 6 years, as many of you who keep in touch with South Asian politics or are from India, Hindu nationalism has become a legible political position in India. And on the other hand, a broad set of revolutionary positions we reflect on as a publication seem to resonate widely as mass struggles take place. This was particularly the case in December 2019. So our wager, like I mentioned earlier, is that with more such publications that are nationally visible, that like pop up on your Instagram feed, and other counter projects, it is conceivable that we can succeed in diluting this role of uncritical politics. Arman just skipped through some slides, just giving you more context as to what's happening in India right now, especially for media platforms, for small media platforms. A few months back, the Indian government enacted a new set of IT rules that is forcing media platforms to comply to forced removal of content. So let me just.
Yeah, and that's basically a function of advertisers getting, like the government being one of the biggest advertisers for mainstream media outlets. So they have a lot of say in editorial decisions. Coming down to artworks and why that's a choice, basically. So I handle almost all of the design and visual aspects for Academy. So I mean, type was a huge pain point for me, but Academy presented a new opportunity for using like design and artworks to, basically marry political concepts with design and to, bring forward information that other people might not be as, comfortable in engaging with. So, and design also gave us the credibility factor that Charu mentioned earlier, which obviously brought on a lot of responsibility. When I attempt editorial illustration for Academy, my basic motto is that no style is the best style. That gives me a lot of freedom to approach every artwork as its own and to craft a solution that would fit its context best. I think art, editorial illustrations are like a cheat code in a way, where we sort of subvert or game the Instagram algorithm into, making it very visual and striking so that more people get to see it. And hopefully the readers would want to engage with the body copy as well. Instagram is visually heavy, so having a visual first approach helps. Also, a lot of constraints I need to take care of when I design anything for Academy. The type has to work within the small Instagram grid, as well as when you see it on your feed. But at the same time, it should also, the illustration and the type should also exist separately, because we also have it on our website. so it needs to also exist separately. So this is constant dance between illustration and typography and trying to make it work together, but also live separately. Here are a couple of examples of how we've adapted illustrations that had a lot of typography on our Instagram, but on our website. This one is one of my favorites just because the article was pretty great. It's about how the Indian government banned Chinese apps and the ramifications of it on the Indian economy. And I think I just took like a very obtuse approach in terms of the trying to communicate the idea of India and China and this divide between the app bans. Also, frequently at Academy, we deal with very complex topics, and this one basically concerned the intersectionality of caste and gender, and just the absolute inaccessibility of justice that women have, especially of marginalized communities in India. So I had to come up with basically artwork solutions that would nuance, that were delicate, but also not provocative, and approach the problem in a very indirect manner, so that it also gave a new visual dimension to it, which people could think about. This one was inspired by Sapporo Winter Olympic stamps that were released in 1972, and I basically wanted to like show a different way of showing injustice in that manner, not just traumatic or depictions that are very common or like a very obvious approach. Similarly, for this article that dealt with about the broken, what do you say? Rehabilitation of drug users and our broken drug laws. So I just went with like an approach where I tried to show drug use in a very obtuse manner, whether it's using botanical illustrations of marijuana from the 1800s or just pills that refract text, just that interaction with it. Similarly, this one was for this article about data privacy, and one of my ideas was how do I display Big Boss, or how would that look, Big Brother, how would that look in 2021 in that way? For the piece, considering only the healthcare aspects of it, my friend Ariana Gupta, she sent like these photographs and I played around with the text arrangement. This one, this is actually not 2D, it's actually a 3D figure, a 3D model, which I'll just show the breakdown. So I start off with this, I add details, I paint on light in Photoshop, match the lighting in the background, and then add details later on. So frequently you'll see these things that happen that I always start at a macro level, move to medium details, and then add final details to polish it off. This was a similar situation for this article. I found a way to basically isolate shadows and the objects, which I could then composite on text. So everything isn't actually done in Photoshop, but I could change the color at any time, and I end up with this. 3D also gives me the flexibility to, in a way, make things that do not exist. Like, for example, in a very crude manner, vaccines did not exist for Indians, or at least for large majority of them, because of our botched rollout. So this was like a piece that I'd made for an essay that dealt with it, basically. And here's a process breakdown where I start off in 3D and I composite and I try to make it look better, and then composite a different background on it. A lot of my process involves analog materials, because I took a very type-heavy class of Power Del kind of at SCA, and that basically inspired me to make a lot of work that involved ink or different materials, like using vegetables, cut paper, for example, crayons, and even like hurriedly scribbled notes, which I then play around with in Photoshop for this piece. The threshold tool is basically the link between the analog and the digital, and that's how I combine both these worlds when I make anything for Academy. And you could see this go through a lot of our works. And similarly, I also try to approach things in a very obtuse manner. I don't think anybody would see Karl Marx represented like this, but that's I thought, why not? We also work with a lot of collaborators. Divya worked on this piece that dealt with how sex workers in British colonial Raj actually subverted incarceration by the British police, and this was one of my favorite works that we've ever done. Oisin did a great job with this when she made this for an event that we had that discussed the criminalization of Dalit intellectuals who were held as political prisoners in India. Various adapts. This one by Amog for a movie review was really good. We went back and forth, and we also developed like this identity system for all the carousel posts inside. Namita came up with this. This was like a very tough topic because these two people, Natasha and Divangana, were incarcerated under terror laws in India, and this was like a very tough topic to deal with. But I think the way she approached it with sensitivity was really good. And Priyanka, she got us this illustration for that about the homosexuality. So on we also had a newsletter that went on for 10 editions. Here are some of them. And this is one of my artworks that I made that I used only my laptop for it. This was on the Beirut aftermath, the blast, and I saw this video where a house just blew up, like it was very calm and blew up, and sort of wanted to simulate that effect, and that's how I made it. We hopefully plan to release like a newsletter later this year, so a print one, hopefully. Like a small experiment, but Academy, I just learned good workflow opportunities to basically organize all my files so that I can always reuse things because we have very tight deadlines. So at the end of it, we end up with about 83 GB of files, around 8,000 files. The biggest folders being here, like our social media for Instagram, is about 45 GB. Everything's uncompressed, and that just taught me like good practices to like back up my data, just how to organize my files so I can always get back to it or reuse them. So yeah, Academy has been live for 531 days, and we are here after 7,879 files and almost 83 GB of data. Charu, you can conclude. I think you're on mute.
Oh, my bad. Thank you. So in the last 2 years, millions of Indians have turned onto the streets to object to the vision with which the country is being guided right now. And the government has fought them with banning gatherings, shutting off mobile internet services in different parts of the country, detaining people without bail for months and months altogether. And it was at this time that we launched our project. We launched it in solidarity, and we launched it to voice our own resilience. The magazine, in part, has proved that even with a very tiny operating budget, Aarman and I pool our resources together. So whatever I earn through my day job and whatever Aarman earns through design commissions is how we then provide remunerations or honorariums to all of our contributors. So with a very tiny operating budget, but an art-centric approach, it is possible to grab the attention of a mass like-minded population. For our future, we want to move forward with a print-first mentality, in part due to certain regulations in the country, but also because we want to develop a more mature and stable publishing attitude. We want to discover new, more radical alternatives in the process. So perhaps if we did not put so much effort into our design and typography, something that we have been criticized at length on Twitter, perhaps we wouldn't have had so many people tune in, so many people read all these incredible, poignant, like extremely sensitive essays, and sharing what these writers have to say. Perhaps, I mean, it does get quite exhausting, even though works of art can shift political ground through ongoing activity. It still does get quite exhausting. In my opinion, and this is something that Aarman and I have discussed a lot, the designer must also be a prudent judge of what should remain undesigned. And because we've used Instagram as our primary publishing practice platform, we find it really difficult to do that. So in the future, we'd love to learn how to do that, to leave things undesigned. Some of the essays that we publish are really impactful, so enduring, and we felt that they should ideally just be as is, but we haven't had the opportunity to really create a space for ourselves where we could do that. Thank you so much again for having us here. Over to you, Shiva.
Thank you, guys. That was incredible. I think I'm speaking for everyone here. And it was very nice to see the process of something that I've been following for so long. We have time for 2 questions, so I'll just get right down to it. An anonymous attendee asked, knowing the culture in India, have you faced political or aristocratic threats due to the whistleblowing nature of your venture? Basically, have you faced threats, trolling? How do you deal with it?
Yeah, so we've faced threats. Any dissenting voice in India, no matter with a big following or a small following, it's just become a rite of passage. And we have faced threats. There've been, and I think it deserves honesty. So I'd be honest to say that there've been moments where we've considered self-censoring, which is why this moment's particularly important for solidarity, for more media organization like ours, to be there for us to really create a community support network. We are really small as an organization. It's just Aarman and me. So oftentimes our funds are also really small. We don't monetize anything yet. We haven't figured out how to do that. We also didn't really want it to impact our editorial and artistic decisions. So it's been tough, but we're figuring out new alternatives going into the future.
Yeah, I think one reason that maybe we might have faced that is a complete hypothesis, but I think nobody expects a lot of this dissenting sort of dissent related work to have such a strong visual focus, or at least it's just sort of confusing at some point that what is going on here. So maybe that it's not as direct, so maybe that could have been a factor, or maybe I'd like to believe that. So
Yeah.
it's just like I said, it's a hypothesis.
We also just come off as really irreverent bunch, just playing with color and talking about really serious issues, almost as if we don't understand their weight and their impact. So maybe that's part of the reason why we've remained slightly unscathed by trolling. But yeah, that answers the question for me.
Cool. There are more questions in the Q&A tab. A lot of them are technical, so I think it would be better if you just type out the answers, what are the fonts you're using, super design questions. But I think we can. I mean, this has been an amazing talk, and we wish you the very, very best. And I personally look forward to following you guys for the rest of this project. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
And so before we go on to our next presenter, we'd like to share with you a few short typographic animations made by our sponsors, especially for this year's conference. And we will have Sulekha Rajkumar present right after this. Enjoy.
And he wakes up and his arm is doing the thing it's kind of glowing whenever he turns it on. So I think he finally unlocked 100%.
Welcome back. Before we get to the next speaker, I'd like to remind all the attendees that you can ask questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of Zoom. So you can use that to ask questions. Please name the speaker before you ask the question so everybody knows who the question is for and they can answer it. Anyway, so the next speaker is Sulekha Rajkumar. She is an independent type designer, lettering artist, and graphic designer. A graduate from Sir J.J. Institute of Applied Art, she previously worked at Ray & Keshavan Brand Union, where she led the design team as senior design director. As a type designer, she collaborates with various type foundries, namely Type, and specializes in both Bangla and Latin scripts. Her typefaces are available on Google Fonts and Apple. She has conducted talks and workshops on lettering, type design, and branding in various design conferences like Design institutes like Srishti Institute of Design. Her work has been featured in Dieline Pool magazine and has received awards at DNAD and Curious Design Awards. She's currently working on a variable Bangla typeface, which is an homage to the crisp structured lettering forms one sees in hand-lettered signs in West Bengal and Bangladesh. She continues to study and experiment with Bangla letter forms through her lettering practice. It's an absolute pleasure to introduce Sulekha Rajkumar, who I have personally been a huge fan of ever since I was an intern. So we worked at the same office. I was a kid at the time. And she was designing typefaces long before the Indian type design scene actually blew up. So anyway, over to you, Sulekha.
Thank you, Shiva. This is such an honor to be here. And I'm so excited to share one of perhaps the areas that in lettering and type design that I focus on the most, which is this very experimental study of letter forms itself. Let me just get this started. Can you see my screen? Yes. Yeah, okay. So I work as a type designer and a lettering artist. And what I'm going to talk about today is particularly the lettering traditions in the Bangla script, how I have studied them, learned from them. And the way I do it really is through experiments and exploration. It becomes this very, like I feel very connected to the letter forms and where I'm just studying the letter forms for the forms itself. And I'll just introduce the Bengali Assamese script. The Bengali Assamese script, as it is known as, is spoken by over 250 million people. It's primarily used, the script is primarily used in India and West Bengal, Assam, and Tripura, and it is the official script that is used in Bangladesh. This script, while it's called the Bengali Assamese script, is called Bangla or Bengali by Bengali speakers, and it's called Assamiya or Assamese by Assam speakers. But let me get to the lettering traditions in Bangla. There is a long history of very experimental, very vibrant, very imaginative lettering. We see this on shop signs all across West Bengal, Bangladesh, particularly Calcutta and Dhaka, where a lot of these references are from. We see them also on the walls, painted on walls. A lot of these are political graffiti or political messages, and it's used primarily as in isolation, where the type just is representative of the meaning and the illustration itself. We see it a lot on vehicles. And as you can see, there are just already a plethora of styles, effects, treatments to what I think is already a very beautiful script. This is a very interesting shop sign. And Shubhajit Chandra has documented this. And it's one of the oldest shop signs in Calcutta. And what is particularly interesting about this one is that it's actually a shop for colors. It sells all kinds of paint and different kinds of colors. And the shop sign is just in monochrome, black and white. And it also leads me to think about all the other lettering that is being done by all these lettering artists, which I feel like they have a view of lettering in a more abstract way. They're not looking for literal representations of concepts, but really letting the form imbibe the meaning. Somewhere in the 1940s, you see a lot of these amazing book covers with this absolutely sublime lettering. And this is the part where I think really excites me, because over here, what these book cover designs, where the lettering is not just complementing the illustration, it's not just leading you to the title, telling you the title of the book. What it's really doing is it is the image itself, and it sets the stage for whatever that the content may be of the book. Many more over here, as you can see. Also, what's something to be noted is that this script has many structures in the letters. Like, for example, you have like two ways of writing the lowercase a, right? In a single storied or a double storied way. And over here, with all these lettering traditions, you see many, many various structures being employed to bring out the meaning of that concept or the word. We see this also in movie posters. These are the works of Satyajit Ray, who's perhaps one of the most renowned lettering artists, known more for his films and direction, certainly. But his work, in fact, a lot of people attribute the publishing lettering scene to Satyajit Ray when he joined in the 1940s, I believe, in Signet Press publishing house. He himself was influenced by Kalighat painting. And you can see that in one of his book covers over here, where the illustration has the proportions and the stroke of the Kalighat painting. But what is really interesting also is that he's ensured that the type has that same feel. It's almost like if the Kalighat painting were to be drawn in letters, what would that look like? He was also influenced greatly by Nandalal Bose. This is it's a children's book written by Rabindranath Tagore, and Nandalal Bose has designed these lino cut illustrations for it. And we can see Satyajit Ray also has, it was greatly influenced by this in his own words. And we can see it now taking form when he starts using type and illustration as well together. What I really find interesting in all these works is that I think you can, if you take out the type, the image is not going to be complete. You need the type. It is very much embedded in the entire visual itself. So what we have is this from the 20th century, like I said, 40s onwards, this very long living tradition of lettering. And a lot of the artists were influencing each other, working across media. So whether it's, films, music covers, publishing, street lettering, and all these pieces are, even though you see very, very distinct styles, they seem to be in conversation with each other. And what I find very interesting about this is that how they learn from each other. And I think that's where I step in. And this is where I take off rather from this long history. And I'm greatly influenced, inspired by these works, and hopefully contribute back if I can. Today what I'm going to share with you is two approaches that I follow in my lettering practice. And really what this is to focus on the letter forms itself, try and understand the proportions, try and perhaps attempt new proportions, new styles, or even just learn from existing styles. So I'll start off, one of the approaches abstract lettering. And abstract lettering is really just a method of drawing letters through abstract or geometric forms that are unhinged from scribal and calligraphic traditions. What I'm going to focus on today is geometric abstraction. Why is, I often wondered why I'm so fascinated with geometry, particularly because, I mean, it's just, there are so many, I studied in JJ where we did a lot of calligraphy, and I'm particularly still fascinated with this idea of abstract and geometric lettering. And I think it might have to do something with the fact that I grew up in Bombay, where there are so many Art Deco buildings, and my school bus would pass by, these old houses, with beautiful Art Deco lettering and signs. I'm very interested and very fascinated by, how different letters are broken down to almost its basic shape. You see geometry all around as well, where on, grills, staircases, tiles, and it just seems like the geometry is the language that you see quite prominently across very, very different mediums. And I think that's why I'm so fascinated by it as well. We go back to way back to the Indus Valley civilization. And I remember seeing this seal actually in school, where if you see over here, the fish is represented in its most minimal form. And while today it seems, well, very basic, that's really how a fish is drawn, and if you're drawing it in an iconographic style. But at the time, to imagine and to look at all the various kinds of shapes and forms of fish, and to distill it to this essential form, I think is quite remarkable. We see a lot of geometry in Islamic architecture, where flora, fauna is represented through these very perfect shapes. In Indic culture, we see it as well. This is a very, very common symbol. It's called the Sri Yantra. And over here, it's made up just primarily of the circle and the triangle, and that center circle, which represents the Bindu, which later became the inspiration for Raza's work. And I think I have probably been greatly influenced by Syed Raza's work, where he sort of represented very complex philosophical concepts through just simple geometry. And while this is, I mean, I use the word simple very loosely, it's a very complex piece of work, but to abstract, detailed philosophies into its most essential visual, I think is, again, very, very fascinating to me. I come back to Satyajit Ray, who I'm greatly influenced by. His work on two magazines. One is a children's book called Sandesh, and one of them is Akon. What he did very interestingly is that he designed multiple lettering book covers for these two publications. And you see a lot of this abstract geometry all across, even done by a lot of other lettering artists. Now, here's where I'm, where I started off my confusion, is that when you start drawing letters with perfect geometry, are they really imperfect letters? Because the proportions get quite distorted. And what I mean by proportions getting distorted, I'm referring to what is considered text proportions, where readers are used to seeing letters in a certain proportion in particular kinds of weight. And when you construct letters with this geometrical view, this abstract view, it really tends to distort that proportion. So one example is something like this, which I worked on last year, just around when the pandemic started and we all had to isolate ourselves. I think I was yearning for everyone to be close by, and looking at letters that are formed from the same language, but their proportions are really quite different. And if you were to pull these letters out in isolation, they wouldn't look they wouldn't look good together at all. So letters like this perhaps wouldn't work well if they were written in a linear fashion. They only work in this composition. This is a piece that I did using my niece's name. Again, it's the same concept where the letters form the image itself. And that's what I'm very, very interested in, where the letters sort of take center stage. So how do I approach this? And I'm going to just break down my process. So I take it one letter at a time. Now this is written in Adobe Bengali, which is designed by Sulekha Rajkumar. This is just to let you know what the typeface would look like in its text sort of avatar, or what letters would look like rather. So I start off with a letter at a time, and this is the way we write ma or mo and you learn it in Bangla children's textbooks, children's workbooks like this. And you start exaggerating the proportions, you start redrawing it so that you get these very exaggerated proportions. And then I start simplifying it to eventually get something like this. All the while, and what I'm trying to do over here is distill the character to its most basic form. And I do that similarly for other letters. And typically I work with them in isolation and then compose it together. So then finally you see, sorry, I think it's, yeah, okay, sorry. And finally you see something like this. Another project that I worked on was the days of the week. These are experiments where I focus on studying the letter forms itself. And I took the letters of the days, and like Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, all of them end with the word day. In Bangla, they all end with the word bar, baro. And that became the starting point for this exercise. Interestingly, over here, I started looking at calligraphic versions of the way the letter form is written. And I started abstracting that rather than the skeleton itself. And then as I keep redrawing it over and over again, I get these very geometric forms, and that can easily sit on a very basic grid with just vertical and diagonal lines, horizontal, like this. And then I also take it, I draw inspiration from a lot of non-typographic aesthetics, like embroidery, tiles. I spoke earlier about grills, and I try and pair type and image together, but really creating one image together, one complete image. Over here, if you can see, I've been influenced by floor tiles, and the one on the right is by embroidery. This project was to just focus on Bangla vowels and to see how they can be abstracted to their most simplest form. These are what the vowels look like. And I follow the same process where I just keep writing the letter over and over again, trying to get those very exaggerated proportions. And then I start building upon this to eventually get a piece like this. After I finished the first piece, I created this second one where I used this one particular tool in Illustrator to create this conical vector that I was quite obsessed with. And I realized that since I have a lot of circles and I have this line going across this circle, maybe that would be interesting to use. And at this point in time, I realized that the moment I used a different tool, not only did it change the aesthetic distinctly, but it also changed the structure. For example, in some letters, if you can see like the first letter, which is the O, you can see quite clearly that the structure itself changes. And that's just a matter of the tool. And I feel like in this case, the tool was doing a lot of the thinking for me. And this brings me to my second approach that I follow, which is something that I've been focusing on more recently. I worked as a graphic designer and branding for many, many years. And I used to I used to say this a lot, and I used to think of it as well, where I, say the design is in your head, and the tool is something that you use to realize that design. But I'm beginning to think that that's not the case. It's not just something, it's not an object that helps you bring your ideas to fruition, but really it is an equal collaborator in the art itself. And in fact, most often it determines that aesthetic. We see this in palm leaf manuscripts. This is an early 12th century manuscript. And just by using a broad nib on palm leaf, you can see that you get this very sharp contrast in the letters, which have also then formed the way we see Bangla texture and from its calligraphic traditions. We see this is something that Satyajit Ray would also do, where he worked and experimented with a lot of tools. He also says that he attributes that to his multiplicity in the way he's able to create so many different styles. Now, this one is where he's used a calligraphic tool. I noticed that this image is not very well scanned, and I will touch upon that later. This is a book cover of, you see over here that the texture itself, that is because it's printed on canvas, you start getting a very different aesthetic, or a very distinct aesthetic, I would say. You see it a lot in painted letters, where the brush is the main tool. And you see these very full monolinear structures that are quite dense. And even though Bangla is a very complex script, calligraphy does help to resolve a lot of the letter forms, and monolinear executions are just, I always get quite inspired when I see something like this, where they can translate very complex forms and still maintain that line weight. Also inspired by Nandalal Bose's illustrations. These paper cut illustrations, lino cut illustrations, which I later try and execute through paper cut, are, I think, also form a very distinct aesthetic in Bengali culture. So coming back to Satyajit Ray, this was the book, this was a magazine called Akon, and here he would design cover after cover, creating these numerous, many lettering styles. And at this point, I thought that this might be a good experiment for me to do. And I started experimenting with both analog and digital tools, and hopefully to find different results. And there's an interesting thing to note that there was this artist called, there is this artist, Herbie Hancock, a brilliant jazz pianist. And he used to work on the acoustic piano. And when he started using, he was actually quite reluctant to start using electronic instruments. But when he did, and he employed those, used those instruments, or rather collaborated with those instruments, his entire sound changed. While people might like his new sound or not, I find is irrelevant. The point is that the tool has so much of importance when determining the aesthetic. So I started off with something very analog, which is using tape to construct letters. What is over here, the tool, because it's tape, it sort of determines that the letters are just going to be straight. And while Bangla has a lot of curved forms, it just restricts that completely. This was an initial scan. And I realized that using the scanner itself as an instrument of art. And that's why I didn't I didn't color correct the previous one, because we often think of, drawing tools, whether they are digital or analog, as the tools to create work, but the printers and scanners play an equal role in determining that aesthetic. A very simple way of illustrating this point is when you use a pixel grid. For example, this is done completely in Adobe Illustrator. You get very basic structures. The moment you increase the resolution of what that the character height is, and you introduce more pixels, you can start introducing concepts like sloping letters or even contrast. This was an initial sketch that I did. The words that I'm working with are akar prokar, and what they mean is different kinds of shapes, forms, types. And if you see all these, the work that I'm showing earlier now are the same words sort of represented differently. This is a sketch that I started looking at pebbles, stone pebbles, and seeing if I could remove the shiro, which is the top headline, trying to see if I could again abstract the letter forms. And then I decided to cut it out. And the moment I cut it, and I use these really heavy pair of scissors, which are not meant for very fine motor skills. So I got these very odd, rough curves, but the straight lines would be super sharp because, and that's just, you know, it's easiest to cut the straight line, but the curves not so much. And you lose the edges that I had from the initial sketch, but it changes now the form, sorry, it changes now the form of the words entirely. And then when I digitize it, I'm looking at these hyper vectorized illustrations, but that are not based on the Bezier curves. So you do get a different curve aesthetic to it. Another piece I'd like to share is this one, which I started with this calligraphic tool. It's a broad nib marker, and it was really in bad shape. So the color was very splotchy when I was working with it, but I quite liked that. And I said, okay, let me use that as an idea to take forward. So I initially digitized this sketch, and then when I noticed that perhaps the structures were not as legible as I would like them to be, so I altered the structures of the letters while I was digitizing it, but I still maintained that same aesthetic that the tool created. And then I proceed to make variations, trying to remove the shiro. Since this started out as counterless, try to introduce counters, and then extended it to the words, and then try to work with, again, type and illustration together. And at this point, another thing that I'd like to mention from the earlier lettering traditions is that you see the same treatments of form, whether it is of the body of the shape of the illustration itself, the terminals, being matched with both the illustration and the letters. And that's something that I've incorporated in this one. And in this way, I'm able to sort of create the same word and letter it in a different way every single time. And then you can, and this is a shorter project, and I feel like the possibilities of this are endless as you move forward. Thank you. I would also just like to add one more thing. As much as I am building upon the work of, like I showed you, the lettering tradition over here, which is a living tradition. But I'm also building upon the work of many people who have researched, documented the script, documented all these beautiful lettering examples. And while I have given credits on each page, what I'm going to do as well is I'm going to create some sort of document where I can share all the links, and then you can access these sources by yourself. But thank you.
Amazing. That was absolutely gorgeous. I mean, it was so inspiring, not just to see the work, but also all the thought and process that goes behind the work. So there's this real kind of narrative. And one thing I love, especially about your work, is that it's not lettering that you can't remove from the context of typeface design. In the sense, I can imagine all of your lettering pieces as typefaces, you know, which is, I don't know if that's a weird thing, but yeah, there's a groundedness in, okay, how this plays out as a system, which is very nice. We have time for one question. One question that I had was, you're not a native of Bengal, right, of Bengali. So Bengali is not your mother tongue. In fact, you're from South. So how did you choose Bengali as your main script to work with? And just to give a kind of disclaimer to all the international attendees, India has over 9 major scripts and hundreds of languages. But it is often common for type designers within India to work with scripts that are not their own. So getting back, can you read Bengali? Do you understand it now, or how
I
did you
can
get
read
into it?
it. I can read it very slowly. My pronunciation is terrible, but I can't understand the language, though I'm learning. I have a lot of people in my family who are Bengali, so I'm trying to learn the language a little bit. But my association with the script started off in college, where we had to work with 2 scripts from India, and I worked with Tamil, which is my mother tongue, and Bangla. And in this, but then cut to many years later in 2015, when I started working as a type designer with 8type, which is actually where I learned type design. And very, very brilliantly talented people who are great mentors. At the time, I wanted to pick Tamil because it is my mother tongue, but there was already a wonderful, brilliant designer called Adarsh Rajan, who's still designing amazing stuff in Tamil. And as a collective, it made more sense. So it was really a pragmatic choice. So I picked Bengali, but haven't looked back since.
Nice. Fantastic. Anyway, I mean, there are more questions for you in the Q&A panel, which you can answer directly. So, but thank you so much for being part of the conference, and it was incredible to see your work. Now, before we go to the next speaker, 1 second. Yes, so right now, before we go to the next speaker, we'd like to show you a few more typographic animations from our sponsors that were made just for this year's conference. You will have Ananya Khaitan present right after this.
Get a font in your inbox every single month. Font of the month.
Future fonts. We've got tall fonts. We've got pointy fonts. You want a soft font? We got it. We got fonts that'll make you scream. We got fonts that'll make you dance. We got fonts that'll make you say whoa, 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 whoa. We've got fancy fonts and groovy fonts and many more. Get them all on Future Fonts.
Can I just say how much I enjoyed those typographic ads? It's so weird. Type designers have the most, insane sense of humor, and all of that is coming through in all these ads, which is awesome. Anyway, I'd like to introduce the next speaker. Ananya Khaitan is a graphic designer with a focus on book design, brand identity design, exhibition, illustration, and writing. His work has been awarded by various bodies such as DNAD, Type Directors Club, Art Directors Club, Communication Arts, and Curious Design Awards, and has been featured by eTapes, is that how we pronounce it? Elephant Magazine, and Eye on Design. Ananya has also presented his work at various fairs and conferences, including Printed Matter 2021, A-Type I 2020, Design in Daba 2020, and ICTVC 2019. He has taught typography at the National Institute of Design. Welcome, Ananya. Where are you joining us from?
Thanks, Shiva. I'm joining you from New Delhi. Thanks for that elaborate introduction, and thanks to the whole team for pulling off this massive operation. I think I'll dive straight in because I do want to leave time for questions if possible. It's my favorite part of stuff like this. Just a second. Awesome. So Shiva, can you just confirm that the presentation is coming fine?
Yep, we can see it.
Awesome.
Go ahead.
So I'm calling my talk today The Endless Joys of Literalness. You'll soon see why. I'll be taking you through 3 of my projects, Lockdown Brain, Avaz, and the 101 Best Movies of the 2010s. The first of these is a personal project, and then the others are professional projects. As tends to happen, the stuff I was trying in my personal project kind of bled into my commissioned work. So I'll start with Lockdown Brain. It's a term I coined last year when the pandemic hit all of us, when the lockdown hit all of us in the month of March. It's inspired by the term pregnancy brain, where basically it's a stir crazy state that happens to people like me, who I was stuck alone in my tiny apartment when the lockdown happened. And I decided I needed some kind of creative outlet for everything that I was going through. For a long time now, I've written a lot of poetry, and I've had like a very sort of strict mental divide in my mind between my design work and my writing, just because I wanted it to sort of stand on its own feet, develop it as its own craft. And hence all I ever did with it was just like roughly letter it and put it out there. But that changed with the lockdown last year. Now I have a quick disclaimer here. I think one of the most odious things someone can be subjected to is unsolicited poetry recitation. I'm afraid that's what I will be subjecting you to today, but I promise to keep it brief and as painless as possible. Bear with me. So this was where the lockdowns happened. All the gyms have shut. I'm eating on my feelings. So I wrote this piece. It strikes me as rather foolish in all matters but salaries that we agreed to pay for things with money and not calories. And I wrote it and I decided I want to do something more with it than I usually do with my writing. And I made it into what you see here, which is basically a paste stub. And that kind of got me like weirdly excited. And I was like, okay, I should do more of these. So I started basically channeling every concern and woe plaguing me during this time into a piece like this. So here I was procrastinating all my work in that state. So this is a piece I wrote. It goes like, my work is always ready. My work is never late. I'm the one that doesn't show when we have a date. My work is never angry, nor does it ridicule when I ask if it's okay if we were to reschedule. My work is always patient and waits till I arrive. And then it smiles and waves and eats me up alive. I made it through Calendar app, and it's actually turns out to be more complicated than one would expect. I basically had to set up a separate ID, send my own ID invites for these events where each of these sort of words is an event, so that when I declined it, it would get struck through. So I was just kind of trying to stay true to the medium I was choosing to make the piece happen. This was in the month of April, by which time all sort of, the one had lost all sense of time and weeks and months and years. So this says, don't know my name, do you? Are we all the same to you? And this I had to stick to, the 7x6 grid of a calendar. So my character count, including punctuation, had to sort of fit within that. So it basically, this interesting sort of process started where the typographic sort of styling I chose to do for a piece came with its own constraints, within which then it was kind of fun to play around. So I wrote one about the stock market, which, as is the case in the States, same happened in India, where even as the working class suffered, the corporate class was bailed out by the government. So in this time of woe and fear, don't forget to shed a tear for those left with petty change, the players at the stock exchange. You, poor when you close your eyes, and penniless still at sunrise, can scarcely imagine the shock of waking up to crashing stock. But worry not, for before long, the government should come along to grant them all a whole new lease, and you can starve to death in peace. So I wrote quite a few like this. I'll spare you the others. I, took a photo of my t-shirt label, changed that, took a photo of some lotion I had created. In this poem is supposed to be the quarantine balm. It's too long for me to read out right now. Did a bunch of these. This was about the insomnia that kind of struck me at a later stage during the lockdown. Sorry, I should have put a strobe warning for that. This was sort of the new email template all of us seem to adopt. Hello, I hope this mail finds you well in these crazy tumultuous times. And while I know that you're dwelling on death and governmental crimes, insert work trivialities that we somehow still can't discard. That's it, back to calamity, my warmest regards. And I'll conclude with this one. I wrote a bunch. This is like a small selection. This is one I wrote entirely using Google autocomplete. Why Corona? Why Corona so bad in Italy? Why Corona worse than flu? What Corona? What coronavirus feels like? What coronavirus do? How much Corona? How much coronavirus in India? How much coronavirus test? Which Corona? Which Corona is gluten-free? Which Corona beer is best? Does Corona always have fever? Does coronavirus spread fast? How long Corona? How long Corona lives on surfaces? How long Corona going to last? This took a deceptively long period of time because I had to kind of try a lot of keywords to find search autocompletes that not only sort of worked as rhymes, but also fit the meter and also kind of gave like an overall structure to the poem. So that was fun. So I made a whole bunch of these. And for me, I mean, I've been sort of trained in the school of Robert Bringhurst, Yancey Cole. Like when I do professional design work, I'm worried about, everything, rags, em dashes, serial commas, stuff like that, those kinds of nitty-gritty. So for me, from where I began, this felt quite like mischievous and rebellious to just kind of play around with form so much. I mean, some of these involved blasphemous things like stretching type and distorting it and so on and so forth. So I kind of, in this sort of liberated state, felt like kind of enthused to kind of infuse this into the sort of professional projects I had going as well. So with that, I'll come to the second project I want to share. This is Awaz. Awaz is a Hindi and Urdu word, which means voice or sound or noise. And in this context, we're referring to the Awaz of revolution. So Awaz was an exhibition curated by a dear friend of mine, Sukanya Bhaskar, in upstate New York. This was, for all the attendees who've been around since the first talk today, it relates to what Aarman and Charu touched upon, which is the state of affairs in India, politically speaking. Very long story short, there's definitely a sort of neo-fascist rise in India. The government is as authoritarian as it gets. So this exhibition was curated in upstate New York with artworks by Indian artists, which were all forms of some kind of resistance to sort of this rise of fascism in India. And because awaz means voice or sound or noise, all the artworks had an oral component. So we had artworks by Base Foundation Roots, Vishal Kumaraswamy and Pallavi Paul. And I was asked to do the design for the exhibition as well as the accompanying publication. And I was encouraged, this is rare for an exhibition design to get this amount of sort of creative leeway. I was encouraged to figure out what could be the awaz of the design in this exhibition. So what we arrived at in collaboration as the sort of overarching idea was the main thing that's lost when this exhibition about resistance in India is transplanted to New York is the thing that is being resisted, which is the oppressive regime, the government itself. So we thought it'd be interesting if the design played the role of the oppressor, so to speak. So we came up with these symbols of fascism, as I call them, the all-seeing eye of constant surveillance, the mouth of endless propaganda, and the fist of brute force, three of the telltale signs of any authoritarian regime. And as an Easter egg in there, all of these have the ruling party's logo scrambled up in their form. And then these were sort of scattered throughout the exhibition to kind of nod to the oppressive regime that's ubiquitous in India right now. But coming to the typography of it, this what you're seeing right now is the title unit that was composed for the exhibition. But I'll be elaborating on that through the publication that accompanied the exhibition. Originally, this was intended as any other exhibition catalog, just listing sort of the artworks, the artists, and the concept note. But the situation in India had become so fraught by then. The CAA NRC protests had broken out, which were protests against a particularly heinous piece of legislation, which would target Muslims and non-Hindus, but Muslims in particular in India. So the curator decided to make the publication a sort of a capsule of its time. And instead of doing a catalog, asked all the artists in the exhibition to submit textual pieces to comment on what was going on. So it was called Awaz Essential Interference. And because it was like this was being sort of collated, different voices from literally different geographic regions at that point of time were being put together. The publication was basically a bunch of loose leaves that we sort of bound together in a sleeve. Production, whenever I do print projects, production tends to be a sort of a big thing I get a kick out of. So these were sort of very rough-hewn cardstock. Everything was screen printed, matte stamped, so on and so forth. It was quite a fun publication. The pieces were very affecting. There were these poems by Vidrohi, a revolutionary poet, which were then translated by Pallavi Paul. There was a eulogy for lost relationships by Vishal Kumaraswamy, which talked about during such politically divisive times, how people find themselves losing relationships over their differences. There was a read, watch, listen list provided of books and podcasts and such to consume during such times. And through it all, what I did with the typography, again, back to the literalness of it all, was figure out different ways to represent awaz, which means sound and voice or noise, different awaz of protest in how the typography works. So interruptions, interjections, sort of giving it overall a gritty, slightly askew feel, chants, echoes, all of these were sort of subtle typographic interventions to sort of allude to what happens to voices in a collective when rising in protest. Little things, such details were scattered throughout the publication, and that sort of became the awaz of the time. And with that, and I want to shout out the typefaces used. In keeping in the spirit of the exhibition and of the spirit of a protest, we used open source typefaces only. This is Inter by RSMS. I needed a deadpan sort of grotesque for what I was imagining. And then I also paired it with Vremena, another open source serif, which has these lovely acute triangular serifs, which I knew would sort of letterpress like a dream. So that's what I needed that for. And I'm coming to the third project I want to talk about, and much lighter fare. The 101 Best Movies of the 2010s was a book that I designed. This was a book created by Battleship Retention, which is an LA-based podcast. They've been around for like, I think, over 15 years now, and I've been listening to them for quite a few years. One of my favorite film podcasts. For just as a quick aside, their name is a play on Battleship Potemkin, which is a 1920s silent Soviet propaganda film, which is often considered one of the most seminal films of all time because the innovation of craft and with editing and montage sequences in it kind of had reverberations throughout cinema. Anyway, so this podcast basically, like all film blogs and podcasts were doing in 2020, decided to put together a list of the best movies of the last decade. This was a listener-generated list where everyone submitted a list and they aggregated it, came out with the top 101 of that, and their entire team of writers wrote pieces for each of those films. And this was the book that they were going to compile. So this is the cover of the book. As you can see, it has some resemblance to one of my initial poems, because the main concept that emerged when I was thinking about how to design this book was possibly this was the last decade of the traditional movie-going experience where one buys a ticket stub and goes to the theater. I mean, that was already jeopardized by the rise of streaming, but what the pandemic has done to our psyche and what the pandemic has done to the theater industry might have been like a huge nail in the coffin of that experience. So because this was a look back at this last decade of that experience, we thought like the book should sort of, pay homage to that. So the cover was styled after the AMC Tickets, the largest theater chain in India. All the information on the cover is the actual information of the book. So the theater chain's name is replaced by the publisher's name. You have the movie name being replaced by the book name. You have the price, the fact that it's listener generated, and so on and so forth. The back, of course, was the back of a ticket. And to make this, I actually went and purchased a secondhand thermal ticketing printer, just because I wanted sort of that unique texture that happens when one prints in these poor quality thermal printers. I wanted that quality in the cover. And then inside the book, used a typeface called Merchant Copy from Darfont, actually. And I would like the typographics team to confirm at the end of this conference if I'm the only speaker who used a Darfont typeface in their work. But it did the job perfectly. It's actually very well designed. And I used it to compose all the headings throughout the book, all the titles throughout the book, like with the slight glitches, the baseline offshoots and kerning errors that would happen in a ticketing printer. For all the movies, it was quite fun to play around with the composition of all the movie titles. Here I'm giving you a glimpse of some of the things on the list. But I stopped at number 10, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, because I'd rather you go buy this book. It's available at battleshippretension.com and find out what was number 1 for the decade. But there was some other fun stuff that I did in the book. Every so often we'd have like a quote from one of the movies, and these were styled, again keeping the literal theme going. These were styled like closed captions or subtitles that one finds in online videos, and the quotes themselves made for a great read. I'd rather be a free spinster and paddle my own canoe. That's from Little Women. I got 2 girlfriends and I'm in a band. I think that's quite a pinnacle to achieve. And then, so also what we scattered throughout this book was because this book was conceived keeping the fans of this podcast in mind. So many sort of in-jokes from the podcast were scrawled in the book in the handwriting of the hosts of the podcast. So in keeping with the same sort of line quality of their handwriting, we developed illustrations for movies, which were sort of, some key objects from that movie itself. Meghna, who was interning with me during this book, she had the equally enviable and arduous task of watching the movies to figure out what would be the illustrations. And that was also an interesting thing to incorporate in the book. And with, this is for Black Klansman, if anyone's seen it. This is for upstream color. And with one of the illustrations in particular, this is like the whole book's ready. It's approved by the podcast. It's almost good to go to print, where the last minute I had a brainwave where one of the illustrations early in the book on page 19, as you can see, was this short rifle, which is Jeff Bridges' rifle from True Grit. And in film and cinema, in theater in general, in those performing arts, you have the famous Chekhov's rule, which is basically that you can't have a loaded rifle on stage if it's not going to go off later. This rule is kind of like a theatrical rule of thumb, which says that you should have nothing superfluous in your screenplay. But it's also literally used, like reviewers in film invoke this rule all the time to, when if a gun appears on screen, they know it's going to go off. So I thought, this is a book for cinema lovers, by cinema lovers. If there is a rifle in the book, then it better go off. So right at the end of the book, in the index, the last T, the T which the rifle was pointing at, fell. And again, coming from where I started from, to me, this is, subversive and out there design. I had fun with it. And this is, there's a quote in the book, which is from the Orson Welles movie, The Other Side of the Wind. If the audience can't get it, then what's the point of even going to the movie? I feel like this True Grit, tiny detail of that T falling off is the kind of thing that almost no one will notice. The one who does will obviously think it's some kind of a mistake, but it's there for me. It's there for the podcast host. It's kind of a fun thing that's just there for us. And to me, that's in the spirit of sort of the new sort of lighthearted approach to typography I found during this last year. And with that, I'm done. Over to you, Shiva.
Wow. That was, sorry. Can you see me?
Yeah.
That was amazing and very rare for a design presentation. That was also hilarious, which is one of the things that I really love about your work, is that there's so much humor in it, which is a very rare quality, I feel, in commercial graphic design. And the diversity of the projects was also really, really cool. I especially loved how in the first one, the Lockdown Brain project, you kind of created rules and systems for yourself and then obsessively followed them, which is, even if the work wasn't strictly typographic, that is a very typographic thing by itself, the working within certain systems.
It's where designers and type designers find comfort, right? Like until the constraints are identified, it's scary.
Yeah, absolutely. If a client tells me you can do whatever you want, I freeze, I can't do anything. But anyway, so there are a couple of questions. One of the questions is there any reason no images were included in the book about the films, which is an interesting choice?
Copyright. That's the only reason. So one of my cover ideas actually used images, but we looked up fair use policies, especially in the States, and it just felt like more than they could take on. So copyright is the reason. There are no images.
Nice. I think the visual language of the book really kind of makes up for the lack of images, which is, it would have probably influenced that choice, right?
Yeah, once that
another question.
Once that
Sorry, go on.
was there, in fact, the closed caption idea came from that, which is that how do I make these quotes interesting, or what if they're all black and you just have the thing, which is what happens when you screenshot Netflix. All you get is the closed caption because it doesn't let you screenshot the image. So that's where that idea came from.
Nice. And there's another question. Thank you so much for an interesting talk. I want to know more about how you go about conducting research while conceptualizing ideas for projects, and how you're able to self-critique and fine-tune your ideas, which is an interesting question in the sense that self-critique, especially within the isolation of the lockdown. How would you answer that?
I think both of these questions hit raw nerves for me, quite honestly, because I think the main niggling sort of issue I always have with live work, client work, especially because I'm at a very small scale of operations, I run an independent practice, is the amount of time on hand doesn't usually allow for the kind of research I would love to do. My research usually tends to be sort of very idea led, It is definitely targeted, convergent research. It is. Haven't gotten a chance to do sort of just open-ended divergent research for any project. And in the case of the book, I mean, of these projects, I think the book was most research heavy, just to figure out what would be the illustrations for the various movies. And that was one of the reasons I took on this project, was I thought I'll have this project, so I'll watch all these movies because I love watching movies. What I ended up doing was I didn't make time for them, so I had to hire someone to watch them and figure out the ideas. So I don't know about the research. And as far as the second thing about self-critique, it's tough for sure. I think for me, just putting it out there, these kinds of environments like conferences and such, and the kind of feedback I get, I think is very valuable there, because before I started my independent practice, I used to work at a design studio. So there, you have peers and you have mentors who that kind of you can bounce ideas off of. Working independently, that's not so much the case. And I think it was quite liberating during the lockdown, because the isolation felt like, okay, I can do whatever I want and no one's looking. I mean, that's not necessarily the case in a digital world, but it felt like that. And I think that kind of felt liberating.
But yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing all this amazing work. I think with that, we can close. Is there another video session? I mean, is there other more typographic ads? Because I would love to see those.
I think we're going to have Ellen join us to close out.
I hope all we really enjoyed the presentation. I really wanted to highlight 3 very different kinds of work that's happening. And yeah, thank you so much, Ellen and Alexander, for having me as a curator this year.
Shiva, it was incredible. Everybody learned so much and was inspired and uplifted and amazed, and it was really a beautiful collection of people and ideas. So thank you for bringing them to us. Thanks to all of you in the audience. Thanks to each one of our speakers and sponsors, and to Cooper Union for continuing to produce this outstanding festival. We are back next week on June 8th. Typographics Day 3 is a series of talks curated by Pega Amani. So see you then. We love it.